At 3 a.m., a wave hits the platform so hard you feel it in your chest before you hear it. Outside, 80 miles per hour winds, no rescue possible for hours. Yet half the crew sleep straight through it, on schedule, undisturbed. This isn't luck. It's a hidden system, and today you'll see exactly how it works. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. To understand how anyone sleeps through a hurricane-force storm at sea, you first need to understand what kind of structure they are actually sleeping on. A fixed steel platform driven into the seabed and a floating semi-submersible held in place by anchor lines are two completely different sleeping experiences. One barely moves at all. The other moves quite a bit. And the engineers who designed each one knew exactly how much movement to expect, long before any crew member ever set foot on board. On the Beaufort scale, hurricane-force wind begins at 64 knots, or roughly 74 miles per hour. So when we talk about 80 miles per hour winds, we are already well past the top of that scale, and the North Sea produces conditions like this most winters. When helicopter operators judge that wind speeds at the helideck exceed a safe threshold, usually somewhere around 60 knots including gusts, flights are grounded. That is the first thing to understand about a storm offshore. It is not that the crew chooses to stay. The transport link simply closes, and whoever is on the installation when it closes is on the installation until conditions improve. The sea state during these storms is often severe enough to have been studied in detail by researchers. Instruments on North Sea platforms have recorded individual rogue waves cresting more than 20 meters from trough to peak during storms whose average wave heights were already substantial. Those extreme waves are outliers, but the ordinary winter sea beneath them is rough enough on its own to make the difference between structure types matter enormously. What all of this feels like inside a cabin depends entirely on what the cabin is sitting on. A fixed steel platform, piled directly into the seabed and engineered against extreme storm loading, experiences essentially no roll. What crew members feel instead is sound and shock, the vibration of wave impact traveling up through the steel legs and into the accommodation module. Experienced hands who have worked full winter rotations on these platforms often describe learning to distinguish ordinary storm noise from the sound of an actual problem, purely by the tone the steel makes. A moored semi-submersible is a different story. There, crews experience real movement, heave and pitch, and that movement triggers a set of standard operational decisions. Drilling operations stop. The riser connecting the rig to the wellhead is either disconnected or secured. The ballast system pumps water into the structure's pontoons to lower it into what is called survival draft, so that the largest wave crests pass beneath the deck rather than crashing into it. Outdoor work is suspended and loose equipment is secured. But inside the accommodation block, life continues on exactly the same schedule it followed the day before. The comparison between rig types is striking. A jack-up rig lifts its main hull entirely clear of the sea, supported on long legs. How far it lifts depends on where it operates. In calmer waters such as the Gulf of Mexico, that clearance might only need to be 20 to 30 feet. In the North Sea, rigs are designed with clearance approaching 90 feet or more to account for the worst storm conditions expected in that environment, nearly 3 times the margin, for essentially the same type of structure. The first real reason people are able to sleep through severe weather is that sleeping was treated as a design priority from the very beginning of the project. On virtually every modern offshore installation, the living quarters form a dedicated structural module, positioned as far as the layout allows from the drill floor, the process equipment, and other high-noise, high-vibration areas. This is not a matter of comfort for its own sake. It is a deliberate decision to treat the accommodation block as its own controlled environment, isolated from the industrial activity happening elsewhere on the platform. On a fixed platform, the physics reinforce this design choice. Steel legs driven deep into the seabed, braced and reinforced, distribute wave loading down into the foundation rather than up into the living spaces. The deck itself sits above the height of the highest wave expected to strike it. So during an 80 miles per hour storm, a person lying in their bunk is essentially inside a structure that behaves more like a building than a vessel. On a semi-submersible, the engineering solution is different but arguably more elegant. The pontoons that provide buoyancy sit below the zone of greatest wave energy. The columns connecting them to the deck are relatively narrow where they pass through the surface, meaning the structure simply does not absorb as much wave energy as a ship-shaped hull would. In survival mode, the entire unit is lowered and ballasted so precisely that waves pass beneath the underside of the deck rather than striking it. The comfort of a sleeping crew member, in other words, is the direct downstream result of a ballast calculation performed hours earlier by an engineer who is likely also asleep by the time the storm peaks. Something many people do not realize is that the quietness of an offshore bedroom is not simply a design nicety. It is a regulatory requirement. On the Norwegian continental shelf, working environment standards cap noise levels in sleeping quarters at 60 decibels, with slightly higher limits allowed in recreation areas, control rooms, and general work areas. These standards go further than setting a single number. They explicitly require that noisy equipment and machinery with high structure-borne sound transmission not be positioned near spaces where noise limits are especially strict, including sleeping quarters, hospital areas, and central control rooms. Consider what that requirement actually means in practice. At some point during the design phase, an engineer relocated a pump specifically because of where a crew member would eventually be sleeping. The UK sector approaches the same underlying problems somewhat differently, focusing on regulations that set action levels and exposure limits for noise exposure over a working day, backed by detailed guidance on how noise and vibration should be managed throughout platform design. One approach designs the room around the person. The other manages the total dose of noise a person receives. Either way, the outcome is the same, a living space engineered so that even in the middle of a severe storm, what reaches the crew members' ears is a low, steady hum rather than the full violence of the weather outside. The least glamorous part of the explanation is also one of the most important. People sleep offshore, in large part, because they are extremely tired. The standard offshore working day runs 12 hours on, 12 hours off, every single day of a rotation, because the installation itself operates around the clock with 2 full crews covering day and night shifts. Add pre-shift briefings and handover time, and most workers are effectively occupied for roughly 13 hours on an ordinary day. Rotational schedules vary, but a common pattern involves several weeks offshore followed by a longer stretch at home. When some operators attempted to extend offshore rotations during periods of lower industry activity, workforce pushback was strong enough that at least one major operator reversed the change. The roster also solves a problem that might not be obvious at first glance. Cabins are typically designed for 2 occupants, and crew scheduling deliberately pairs roommates on opposite 12-hour shifts. This means that, for most of any given day, one occupant is at work while the other sleeps, effectively giving each person the room to themselves most of the time. Research into North Sea shift patterns has found that alertness and performance remain relatively stable across a run of consecutive day shifts, and that full physiological adjustment to night shifts typically takes around 5 to 6 days offshore. Beyond the structural engineering and the regulatory framework, a layer of small, human-scale routines does the final work of making sleep possible. Survival suits, life jackets, and helicopter transfer suits are stored inside each cabin, hanging within a few feet of the bed as a constant, practical reminder of exactly where the crew member is. Most workers report that after the first couple of days, they simply stop noticing these items. Blackout curtains are standard issue on modern installations, since roughly half the crew is always trying to sleep during daylight hours. Earplugs are common, and experienced crew members quietly angle for cabin assignments as far as possible from noisy areas like transfer zones and the galley, not out of fussiness, but because the difference in sleep quality can be significant. Meal service plays a larger role than most people would expect. Food is typically available across several windows throughout the day and night, including a late-night service designed specifically so that workers coming off night shift can eat a proper hot meal before going to bed, rather than something quick and cold. During a storm, when almost everything else on the installation is disrupted, this schedule tends to continue uninterrupted. Daily housekeeping is standard on most rigs, cabins and bathrooms cleaned, laundry returned the same day. These small comforts matter enormously several weeks into a long rotation. Crews also tend to develop habits like securing loose items before a storm hits, almost automatically and without being instructed, simply because it has become routine. Once a shift ends, the boundary between work and rest is generally well protected, giving workers genuine downtime even during severe weather. It is worth being honest that this system, while generally effective, has not always worked. Offshore history includes serious incidents in which storms overwhelmed the protections built into rig design, instances where waves struck accommodation areas directly, causing injuries and, in at least one well-documented case, a fatality inside living quarters that were assumed to be safe. Investigations into these incidents have sometimes concluded that existing regulations underestimated the horizontal forces that severe waves could exert on floating structures. The earliest and most severe of these incidents, decades ago, involved the structural failure and capsizing of a floating accommodation platform during a storm, resulting in significant loss of life among crew members who were off duty at the time. Much of the modern regulatory framework governing offshore accommodation design was written in direct response to that disaster. Beyond structural risk, offshore rotational work carries a documented mental health burden. Industry research has highlighted elevated rates of psychological distress among rotational offshore workers compared to onshore counterparts, along with lower reported work-life satisfaction on longer rotation schedules. The same storms that keep workers asleep and safe inside a well-engineered cabin are also the storms that can strand them offshore well past their scheduled crew change, sometimes for days. The newest layer of protection is predictive rather than reactive. Specialized weather forecasting services now model not just general wind and wave conditions, but the specific motion behavior of individual floating installations, predicting how a particular rig's heave, pitch, and roll will behave days in advance, alongside a simple status indicator for helicopter operations. This allows operators to plan crew changes proactively, moving non-essential personnel off an installation before a storm arrives rather than scrambling afterward, and disconnecting risers on a planned timeline instead of under time pressure. The broader offshore workforce is also changing shape, with significant contraction expected in traditional oil and gas roles over the coming decade as expertise increasingly shifts toward offshore wind development. Those newer installations operate under many of the same helicopter and weather rules, in the same waters, facing the same storms. Ultimately, nobody sleeps through an 80 miles per hour North Sea storm because they are simply tough enough to ignore it. They sleep because of a long stack of decisions made well before they ever boarded a helicopter, a hull shaped to shed wave energy, or legs driven deep into the seabed, a legal standard limiting bedroom noise to 60 decibels, a roster that places a roommate on the opposite shift, a hot meal at midnight, a blackout curtain, a pair of earplugs, and a survival suit hanging quietly on the back of the door that stopped being noticed weeks ago.